I'm Jocelyne Cesari. I am a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, and I had the privilege and honor to serve as guest editor with my colleague May Cannon on a special issue of the Review of Faith and International Affairs that is actually on the table, so feel free to get a copy on your way in or out. And so this event is really to make the work we have done in this special issue a little more present in the public debate. And it has been organized in conjunction with the 2 days that just ended of the IRF Summit. So I will say more when the time comes, but I just wanted to welcome you in the name of the Berkeley Center, and to let you know also about the order of this event. So I will give the floor in a few minutes, just to give more time to people to finish the lunch, to Dennis Hoover, who is the chief editor of the review. Then I will say a few words on my contribution and the overall structure of the issue. Then May Cannon, my co-author and companion, will present her own work. Then Mitch Noor will also present his own work in the issue. We have many more other contributors that could not make it here, but I will say a few words on each. And at the end of the session, Greg Mitchell, the founder of the IRF Secretariat, will join us. He will introduce his organization, and we will also, with May, say a few words on a new initiative called the Global Academic Council that is related to the IRF Secretariat, and for which this special issue is actually the first concrete work we have done together. So I give you a couple of more minutes to eat and drink, and then we can get started.
That's great.
Thanks, Jocelyne.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, folks. We might as well get started. You can feel free to continue eating and get up and grab whatever you need as we proceed, but we'll get underway with our panel. My name is Dennis Hoover. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Review of Faith and International Affairs, and it's really my pleasure to be able to share this special issue with you. I'm usually pleased with every issue that's produced, and I tell the folks that contribute to it it's the best one we've ever done. This time I really mean it. I think this one is really good, and not just, it's the consistent quality across the board, but I also think it marks something significant sort of in the development and maturation of the field of religious freedom studies. And in fact, when the journal started over 2 decades ago, I don't think you really could have said, honestly, that a field of religious freedom studies quite existed. And so the fact that we've reached this point in terms of the quantity and quality of research out there that's either directly about religious freedom or about the whole complex swirl of issues that contribute to religious freedom, the fact that we're at this stage that we can gather together esteemed scholars to kind of take a step back and look at where we're at as a field, what the accomplishments are, and what the gaps are, I think is an important that we've reached this point. Why? I want to make a few quick comments to put that in some context. The Review of Faith and International Affairs launched in 2003 under the tutelage and sponsorship of the Institute for Global Engagement, headed at that time by the esteemed Dr. Chris Seipel, who we're honored to have with us here today. At that stage, there were several barriers, I think, to there being something we would call a field of religious freedom studies. And certainly within academia and foreign affairs elites generally, something that David Brooks identified as the secularist habit was still quite powerful, which was quite familiar with secularization theory and how its predominance in the field helped constrain awareness at a minimum of religion, the role of religion in world affairs. and in some cases, even worse, sort of resulting in quite misguided or sophomoric analyses of the role of religion and the way it matters. Another sort of habit in the field that's directly related to that was messing up or holding back the development of the field, which I would call the securitization habit. So to the extent that religion was noticed and factored into analyses at all, it tended to be looked at as a source of a problem. Is religion contributing to our security problems and in general and to terrorism specifically? And then there were a range of problems emanating from the sort of religious freedom advocacy world as well that I think were, even though activist organizations were growing in number and size through the late 1990s, and were a big reason that we had an International Religious Freedom Act passed in 1998, there was a kind of still sort of special pleading habit across the field where individual groups were advocating for their own particular co-religionists and less of an emphasis on thinking systematically about religious freedom for all groups across all societies, and related to that as well, a kind of legalism habit. We're thinking about religious freedom in absolute terms and in terms of human rights as articulated in international human rights documents. An important way to think about it and an important methodology for advocacy, of course, but again, less of a habit of thinking in a kind of social ecology perspective. Well, what are the overall conditions? What are under what environmental conditions, so to speak, from both the top down, government policy, constitutions, and so forth, but also the bottom up, cultural norms, practices amongst religious groups themselves, and broader cultural norms. How do you get a sustainable environment of religious freedom to actually exist in a society? So those broader kinds of questions were only just beginning to be asked, and I think over the last couple of decades, scholars have gotten a lot better at asking them. So, and then last point, there was a sort of anecdotal habit, thinking about what counts as evidence in religious freedom research. Used to be more case study based and anecdotes of this a problem here, a problem there. And then analyzing backwards from those particular failures to try to diagnose what's going on. But fortunately, through the efforts of organizations like the Pew Research Center and also the Religion and State Project out of Bar-Ilan University, and other groups as well, the state of truly systematic social scientific data about religious freedom is far more advanced today than it used to be. So it enables more of a truly academic approach to identifying the status of religious freedom, and then also a more sophisticated way of thinking about strategies in response. So with that said, this particular collection of articles, again, is it doesn't address everything, but it does a nice survey of some of the key areas. And with that, I'll hand the mic back, the imaginary mic back to Jocelyn to discuss her contribution, and then we'll proceed down the line with our speakers and finish with some Q&A later. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Please. So, besides presenting my own contribution to the spatial issue, I would like to give or provide a few words about the whole structure. So I will try to include in my presentation references to some of the articles, at least because lots of contributors are not present here. So, the future of religious freedom, okay? Well, so what does this mean? The first element that came very strongly is globalization of the religious freedom agenda. It seems obvious to us now. And we just finished yesterday the IRF summit that has a global scope, but not very far in time. Religious freedom was first and foremost a national issue. not a global issue. It was enshrined in discussion, and it's still enshrined in discussions on democracy and tolerance and civil liberties. But more and more, we see, and we have witnessed, at least in the last 3 decades, a rise in a global discussion on religious freedom. It doesn't mean that everybody agrees, but the platform, the forum is now global. And it is, I think, not only because the landmark mentioned here, the 1948, but also Act, but also the ICCPR Act, for the one who may not like abbreviation like myself, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966, which is really the starting to implement, or the implementation of the principle enunciated in 1948. We have seen gradually the rise of also what I would call, for lack of a better term, the governmental and intergovernmental watchdogs, you know. And in this sense, the IRF, the International Religious Freedom Act of the US, was quite pioneer. And I was quite struck in the last 2 days at the summit to see how much of this global strategy is now a given for all participants. And there have been moments, I have followed this since 1998, right? There was a lot of time and pushback against this position of observing from the US perspective what is the status of religious freedom. These questions still exist, but what I heard in the last 2 days is also turning to the US and other governmental agencies to try to keep up some standard and some accountabilities about protecting religious freedom beyond borders. And that was quite interesting to hear in this sense. So, having said that, what does it mean that the agenda of religious freedom is global? There are a few issues that are really coming up at the forefront. The first one is about conceptual tension, and I use the term concept here not in an academic sense, but in the way that actors of different backgrounds are presenting the issue of religious freedom. The first one is individual versus collective right. The second one is negative versus positive liberty. So let me tell you more about that. So the individual right of conscience and religion, religious action is enshrined in American political culture. So this is obvious to most of us here. But it's not the major way today that religious freedom is coming up. It's not only religious or consciousness, I would say, or freedom of opinions and act at the individual level. It's also a collective issue. And the European Court of Human Rights, which has become one of these watchdogs I mentioned previously, has really pushed towards the recognition of religion as a collective right. A few examples. I start with Pastoral Shelboun versus Romania in 2013. A group of Orthodox priests wanted to create a union, and the state, siding with the church, said, no, you cannot do that. So they put their case to the European Court of Human Rights, and the Court of Human Rights said, no, the state is right. You cannot challenge the collective integrity of the Orthodox Church. This is collective right over individual right of religious freedom. So this is happening not only in Europe, but everywhere. And the more you get away from the Western center, the more the question of human rights is phrased in collective terms, so to speak. I will also, for the sake of time, you may know more about this Lao Tzu versus Italy. It's about the crosses in the classroom. At the end, the European Court of Human Rights did the same decision, provided the same decision. The crosses can stay on the wall of the classroom because this is a collective symbol of the Italian culture. Religion is a collective symbol. Okay. So sometimes it takes over individual freedom. And we, from the American point of view, we have to be very aware of that, because sometimes we just project the idea of freedom, of religious freedom as individual rights, without taking into account that sometimes most of the conflicts are on the collective aspect. The negative versus positive. Again, here you have the dominant, the staple of non-interference, which is, again, in the American political history, very central. I'm not going to go in more details. You know this as much as I do. The Scherber versus Werner case in 1963. But we see more and more legal position for the positive aspect of defending religious freedom, meaning not only the authorities do not interfere, but they become proactive in accommodating or opening new spaces to help or to provide religious institutions or people with a change in the policy in their favor. And here I give a case in Canada where there was a student from the Sikh tradition that was wearing, that came to class with a sword. And the school said, no, you cannot get into the class with a sword for security reasons. The Canada court refused this position and said, you have to make accommodation for this student because it's part of his religion. It is not about a political act, it's part of his religious tradition. He can wear this, so you school have to accommodate. So again, this is another tension. The two tensions, individual, collective, positive, negative, are intertwined. So we are also witnessing what used to be tolerance, you know. Now you know this even, again, that's a big thing. It's not enough. Tolerance is not enough. So what is emerging is the recognition and action of what's called belief pluralism. The term is not mine, it's from Tarek Moudoud, my colleague in the UK. So, which means that you have to take, people are encouraged to take more and more proactive actions and positive interferences with political institutions to secure not only their values, but their practice, their narrative, etc. And the idea, this is very strong in Europe, maybe less here. It's about protecting all beliefs, including the not only theistic, non-theistic, but also atheistic. The Europeans are very strong on protecting the freedom of not to believe in God. So this is challenging also the Western secular assumption of state neutrality, because as I just mentioned with the Canadian case, the state is more and more pushed into interfering and accommodating. So I have 1 minute left. I wanted also to mention that we are touching on issues now on digital life of religion. We have an article especially dealing with that, and I think it's just the opening of the field. And the lawyers are far behind, not only for religion, but about the protection of freedom of expression online. I mentioned this case is Turkey versus Grok. I don't know if you know about this case, but the Turkish state convicted Grok, the robot or chat, I don't know what, because it was producing insulting position vis-à-vis the Islamic values of Turkey. So we're going to have to deal with that at one point or another. So you have a push from religious organization, and you have a push from state to still control this domain. And we are in the middle of a crisis in Iran. One of the things that the state has done in Iran is to shut down any kind of digital platform. So we are here, and again, we are behind, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of legal position. And I have, 3 seconds or 0 seconds to say that we cannot look at religious freedom in isolation anymore. The fashionable term is intersectionality. It used to be just called overlapping. That is what it is, overlapping issues. So you have multiple layers of exclusion, and we have to take them into account all together. For example, if I am a Dalit Christian woman in India, where do I put the emphasis on my religious freedom? Is it because I am a woman, I am Dalit, or I am a Christian? And you cannot separate the three. And this is challenging for scholars, because we are used to operate in our own little silos, I deal with the Dalit, I deal with Christianity, I deal with gender issues. And this is not a new appeal, but it's still good to remind us that it's not enough to say we are interdisciplinary. We have to walk the walk, and we are not walking it. And I'm pretty strong on that, but I can explain more on that. So I will just stop there, because again, this presentation is to show you the different angle and the unexplored zones that the special issue really tried to bring together and to put to shed the light on. Thank you. So now I give the floor to May Cannon, who is the executive director of the Church for Middle East Peace, if I am.
That's right.
Right.
We're doing great at our job in that, by the way. So I'm the executive director of Churches for Middle East Peace. I'd encourage you, Chris, can you wave to everyone? Chris will be around if you're interested in learning about our work at CMEP. We have some resources and things at the front where we'd be happy to talk to you about that. I love being here in this space because I'm an avocational academic. And so every once in a while, when I engage with Jocelyn and the Global Academic Council of the International Religious Freedom Secretariat, I get to enter into that academic space, but really I'm a practitioner. My academic background is very interdisciplinary. I have a Master's of Divinity. I'm an ordained minister in one of the few evangelical denominations that ordains women. I have an MBA and a Master in bioethics. My doctorate is in history, American history, with a focus on the Middle East, looking specifically at American Protestant engagement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then I have a doctorate of ministry in spiritual formation. And the reason I say that is I come to this academic space with a bit of a different lens. And I'm honored to work alongside Jocelyn. She is brilliant. She just received an award for international religious freedom. And many people around the world defer to her, and go to her academic research and study. And so it's a great privilege to work alongside of her. And this journal would not have happened without Dennis. I love that you say it's a journal, you say that they're all your favorite or they're all the best, and that this one, we like to tease that, is it Fox? Is Fox the scholar who we quote throughout the whole thing, who said it was brilliant, and we think it might just be because we quoted him? Is he
we
the
do
one?
cite him a lot, so maybe a little biased.
So I had the privilege of writing an article. I sometimes tease, I write about that which I do not know. It gives me an opportunity to research it, to seek to understand it. And the article I wrote was on civilizationism. How many of you are familiar with that study? Oh, good. Neither was I. Civilizationism, the article is on populism, nationalism, and civilizationism. And I had to laugh when Dennis said it's much more sophisticated to do statistical analysis and research and not case studies. My entire article is case studies. And I think part of the reason is because civilizationism is such a new form of study. So that's what I want to talk to you about. My article was on the implications of populism, nationalism, and civilizationism as it relates to implications and complications for religious freedom. One of the things that I was seeking to look at was what research has been done about populism and the polarization that we're seeing happen globally. Certainly here within the US, domestic context, we're seeing this happen politically, religiously, across the world as well. And this is one of the major defining shifts of the 21st century, this rise of cultural populism and what is now being termed civilizationism, which I'll talk about and explain more. And what some of the things that we see that are further evidence of this 21st century shift is that we're seeing an increased societal polarization, this us versus them mentality. It can happen politically, it can happen even in terms of the term evangelical. I self-identify as an evangelical. Saying that in some contexts is viewed as an asset. Saying that in other contexts, you are dismissed before you even begin to articulate your perception or opinions. We also see this in examples of democratic backsliding. I really appreciated Jocelyn talking about talking about the way that one of the goals of international religious freedom is the ability for different religious groups, both individually, but also as communities, to be able to exercise their rights. And we sometimes see this polarization specifically manifested as a threat to democracy and democratic backsliding. So some of the examples I talk about are Egypt and Thailand and Venezuela. I think civilizationism and the study of populism is an extension that helps us better understand religious freedom in different contexts, but particularly religious freedom as a core liberal democratic principle. And this is where I do quote Jonathan Fox. He talks about the two dominant conceptions of international religious freedom being the free exercise of religion, but also the equal treatment of different religions by the state. And so the political question is one that intersects directly with the religious one. Jocelyn talked about the legal framework of the history of international religious freedom a bit, but there's a scholarly debate about what religious freedom might look like for it to be as functional as possible. So I'd refer to Winifred Fowler-Sullivan and also to Mark Jurgensen-Meyer. Academics don't know how to pronounce words. Have you ever heard that before? So Jurgensen-Meyer is one of the leading academics who's writing about civilizationism, and he talks about how religious freedom has to be aspired to within societies, but that it's imperfect, and yet it's still a viable mechanism that should be engaged by states and individuals and communities. So, talking about religious nationalism and its integration with international religious freedom, we are seeing a rise and an emergence of religious nationalism, again in the US context, but also in different communities around the world. And one of the reasons why is because of the failure of secular nationalism. And so the result is a religious nationalism, a desire for a moral, cultural, and political coherence. Examples of this that are addressed in the article include India, Myanmar, Turkey, Israel, and the United States. So the example specifically in the case study of India talks about these different groups, some that are promoting Hindu nationalism under Modi, but others that are combating that directly. And I have acronyms here without spelling out what they are. But BJP and RSS would be some of the opposing groups. And that results in a shrinking space for dissent and a decrease of minority rights. And so there were riots. The Gujarat riots are an example of where that shrinking space for dissent of some of these minority groups was an illustration of the violence that has been fueled by this rise of religious nationalism. Civilizationism is now a new form of study that has its intellectual roots in Edward Said and Orientalism. You are familiar, I'm sure, with The Class of Civilizations by Huntington. You might be familiar with the book about provincializing Europe by Depeche Chakbardi. And so there's a contemporary definition of civilizationism that says the world is divided into civilizations which are primarily defined by religion. Civilizationism, it replaces the nation as the primary identity marker. So nationalism might contribute to civilizationism, but the civilization as a whole is a higher value than the nation state. Civilizationism is viewed as an essentialist and hierarchical perspective and worldview, and it's a relationship that includes exclusion, superiority, and political ideology. So cultural populism and the intersection of religion are subsets of civilizationism. The article talks about civilizational populism as a theoretical framework. Some of the core features of this include the idea that there is a pure people versus corrupt elites, that there are dangerous quote-unquote others, and they should be differentiated from inferior civilizations, that there's a moral superiority that's grounded in religion. Religion is viewed as the source of the legitimacy of the civilization, and so religion is elevated in this context. And this has severe implications for international religious freedom because it provides a context that says we should protect religious groups, but the dominant religious group should be protected more, right? That we should have restrictions or exclusion of minority religions because they're not as valued within this civilizationist context. That there are legal and cultural marginalization of groups because of this privileging. I go through what this looks like in some specific some specific case studies. So I talk a bit about the US context. I was fascinated about what this looks like in Europe. In the Netherlands, for example, you might be familiar with Pim Fortuyn. Does anyone know that politician? I did not prior to doing this research. He is a civilizationist. He believes in civilizational populism. And so his political manifestations look similar to Trumpism in the US. He is very opposed to Islam. His rhetoric is anti-Islamic, but it's paired, unlike the US context, with liberal stances on things like LGBTQ rights, gender equality, free speech. And so the manifestation of this civilizational populism in Europe looks very different than it does in the US context. I talk about Turkey as a case study under Erdogan. Erdogan wants a democracy that has privileges, that has international religious freedom, but it's privileging the Muslim community and the Islamic community, for example, over minorities like Christians and others. Indonesia is an example, the Islamic Defenders Front, which promotes populist Islamism, where there's a binary framing of who are the true Muslims versus the elites or others who might be minorities. So all of this, civilizational populism, has implications for religious freedom. Religious freedom should be a tool for preserving everyone's religious identity, not only the dominant religious identity. Religious freedom under civilizational populism is a mechanism for the exclusion of minority groups. And one of the concerns or questions or things that we're looking at in terms of our studies are what is the legal what are the repercussions in the legal context? If these types of beliefs become legally codified, they will reinforce these hierarchies and these privileging within societies. So while civilizationism is a very young discipline and field of study, there are opportunities for future research and further study. So one of the things we're calling for, and we hope to do as the Global Academic Council, is to expand the geographic scope. Mostly the places that have been studied have been Western. And so to look at what does this look like globally and in other contexts. That we want to increase the diversity of the scholars who are engaging in this space, regardless of what their discipline or background may be. The religious focus has been primarily Abrahamic. Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. So what does it look like for other religions to be included in the study? We want to examine historical case studies beyond the modern era, and there's a need to attend to the variation of populist manifestation, regardless of the context. So in conclusion, civilizationism, populism, religious nationalism, they are deeply intertwined. There are common characteristics of binaries across social divisions, the privileging of one religious or civilizational identity over another. There's the erosion of pluralism within societies, and there's the erosion of democratic norms. So there's a need for continued comparative and interdisciplinary research moving forward. Thank you. Oh, I didn't introduce
Mitch,
Yeah.
no?
Yeah.
Introduce yourself.
Okay. So my name is Mitch Four. I was in military intelligence. I'm a religious freedom advocate. I've done consulting for the Religious Freedom Institute, for example, and I have a background in Christian theology. But I'm not a scholar. I'm more of a practitioner. So as someone who almost studied applied intelligence at Georgetown, it's an honor to be here. In the fall of 2013, I visited Hebron in the West Bank. A small group of Palestinians invited me and a few others for tea to discuss the children's school they were operating in Hebron, and they soon began describing what it was like to live in a highly securitized and volatile context, how movement is restricted, trust eroded, and how the simplest act of getting to work or school can become a negotiation. Afterward, a young Muslim woman and her brother offered to show me their city. They walked me near Shuhada Street, markets, and finally to the tomb of the patriarchs, half mosque, half synagogue, a single building split in two, each side sacred to many and each side scarred. They pointed to the bullet holes still etched in stone from the attack years earlier. Standing there, I felt the weight of a truth I didn't yet have language for, namely, in places of profound religious meaning, peace is both incredibly fragile and desperately needed. That night, back in Jerusalem, I pulled out my iPad and I was scrolling Facebook. I saw a photo of one of the young men I had met only hours earlier, someone who had been joking with us, hospitable and eager to share and show his hometown to us. But in the photo, he was bloodied, slumped against the wall as if he had been beaten. I had insufficient context to determine what had happened, but maybe that's the point. In conflict zones, dignity can be stripped from a person faster than the world can make sense of it. And so I think it's easy to assume what happened, but I don't know and I don't want to assume, and that's part of the point. That moment has stayed with me because it crystallized something essential. Security without dignity is insecurity. Control without rights is not peace. And when religious identity becomes a fault line, when faith itself is policed, restricted, or weaponized in any context, the consequences are written on human bodies. And I think we're seeing this in Iran as we speak. Sadly, what I saw in Hebron was not an isolated story. Today, global data show that roughly 83% of the world's population lives under significant religious restrictions, from legal barriers and discrimination to outright persecution. This isn't a marginal issue. It's a global trend that shapes patterns of conflict, governance, and security. By conducting a landscape review of the relevant scholarship, identifying key themes, addressing misconceptions, highlighting relevant tools, and even identifying gaps and opportunities for further inquiry and follow-up, my co-authors, Jeremy Barker, Scott Gustafson, and myself, sought to offer empirically grounded guidance on how religious liberty contributes to stability and reduces the risk of radicalization and violence. We hope our synthesis and critical reflection not only advance the discussion on this important topic, but also lead to further contributions from scholars, policymakers, and practitioners alike. For the sake of brevity, however, I'm not able to cite every data set, scholar, or study in my speech. If interested, please see our article for greater detail. Over the past 2 decades, research at the intersection of religion and conflict has accelerated dramatically. New data sets and methodologies are giving us clearer insight in how religious freedom, or its absence, shapes national security outcomes. One of the major breakthroughs was the creation of the RELAC dataset in 2018, which provides detailed information on religious dimensions of armed conflict from 1975 to 2015. Another significant effort is the Religious Minorities at Risk Project, which covers more than 770 minority groups across 183 countries and analyzes how deprivation, discrimination, and inequality fuel grievances that can escalate into violence. and the Violent Incidents Database now offers one of the only publicly accessible event-level measures of violations of religious freedom, revealing patterns of victimization, perpetrator identity, and subnational variation. Together, these projects signal something important. Namely, tools are advancing to study religion and conflict with the same empirical rigor that has long been applied to other drivers of instability. But we must also acknowledge that significant gaps remain. We still struggle to capture local variation, specify causal pathways, and translate research into effective policy. Yet even with these limitations, a consistent picture has emerged. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that repressive restrictions on religious practice, whether imposed by governments or through social hostilities, increase the risk of terrorism and violent mobilization. Discrimination radicalizes moderates, it heightens grievances, erodes trust, and strengthens hardline factions. And repression cuts both ways. In the words of Henny and Hand, when governments privilege a dominant religious groups, minorities may respond with violence as a quote-unquote weapon of the weak. But majorities, too, may escalate using religion as a weapon of the strong when the state endorses their identities. In contrast, where religious pluralism is protected, the dynamic reverses. Robust religious freedom reduces incentives for violence, expands civic participation, and deprives extremist groups of legitimacy and support. When communities are granted peaceful channels for expression, their spiritual capital is freed for peace building, and the coalition defending democratic norms grows stronger. Ultimately, religion is neither inherently violent nor inherently peaceful. As Scott Appleby put it, it's ambivalent. It amplifies the surrounding political and social context. Religious freedom then becomes a strategic tool, a national security lens that encourages constructive outcomes rather than coercive ones. But this reality is often obscured by misconceptions. Since 9/11, counterterrorism policies have disproportionately focused on Islamist extremism. But extremism is not confined to one religion, region, or ideology. Islamist groups, yes, but also far-right movements, Jewish extremist cells, Hindu nationalists, as been alluded earlier, Buddhist militias, and secular ethno-nationalist groups have all mobilized violence. When states fixate on only one group, they overlook real risks, and they hand extremists the very narratives of persecution they crave. Flattening conflict to a single religious antagonist is analytically wrong and strategically counterproductive. It ignores political instability, inequality, repression, social networks, and group dynamics, all of which matter profoundly. It also misses a critical truth. Extreme beliefs do not necessarily lead to extreme behavior. Many perpetrators of religiously framed violence do not exhibit intense religious practice, and psychological studies show that extremists often resemble the general population more than we assume. Similarly, explanations based solely on poverty or mental illness have been largely disproven. People radicalize on micro, meso, and macro levels, for example, through trauma, exclusion, search for belonging, unmet needs for dignity, political grievance, or sudden destabilizing events. And state responses matter enormously. Heavy-handed or discriminatory security measures fuel cycles of mutual radicalization, validating extremist narratives, and extending the lifespan of terrorist movements. It is no coincidence that the majority of successful terrorist groups collapse under their own unpopular tactics, unless state repression unintentionally gives them a reason to fight on. So what do we do? First, governments must recognize that protecting religious freedom is not merely a moral choice. It's a security strategy. But rhetoric matters. Political speech that stigmatizes communities can become tender or flammable when combined with inequality or deprivation. Second, policy makers should work closely with civil society, religious leaders, and local peace builders. These actors are indispensable in documenting abuses, mediating tensions, and countering radicalization, both locally and online. Security forces must also distinguish carefully between individual perpetrators and broader identity groups. This is why religious literacy must become a core competency within policymaking, diplomacy, policing, and security analysis. not necessarily literacy in doctrine, but in how religion shapes identity, social networks, grievances, dignity, and hope. Without it, states misread motivations, misdiagnose threats, and implement policies that deepen insecurity. Third, religious leaders themselves play a critical role. They can either reinforce othering narratives or counter them. They can either inflame conflict or provide dignity, inclusion, and a sense of shared civic purpose. In an era of digital radicalization and AI-driven disinformation, their voice is more important than ever. For researchers, 3 priorities stand out. Western democracies often assume their model of religious freedom is universally applicable. Better scholarship must integrate perspectives from across cultures, including insights about sacred values, honor, shame, and trauma. Religious inequality indicators should be incorporated into development frameworks and global indices. While, for example, poverty alone does not necessarily cause terrorism, systems of discrimination, especially religious discrimination, remain powerful drivers of grievance. Researchers need to clarify better how belief relates to behavior. We need better models that distinguish cognitive, affective, and behavioral radicalization, along with research on ethno-religious states and the impact of state violence or state terrorism. In closing, religious freedom shapes the trajectory of nations. It strengthens social cohesion. It reduces violence. It sustains peace. And far from fading, religion is arguably becoming more influential globally. That means the stakes around religious freedom are rising, not falling. We have made enormous progress in understanding these dynamics, but we now need better data, deeper interdisciplinary work, and perhaps most urgently, policies that take this research seriously. We hope that scholars, practitioners, and political leaders will work together toward one shared goal: the systemic integration of religious freedom into global peace-building strategies. Because when we protect religious liberty, we don't just prevent extremism. We create the conditions for human flourishing and stable peace. Thank you, and God bless.
Hello, everybody. Sorry I'm late. It was quite an adventure getting here, but I made it. So my name is Greg Mitchell. I'm happy to be here. Very happy to join my colleagues on the leaders of our Global Academic Council, and with Dennis Hoover, friends, and Chris Seipel and other friends. I saw David Saperstein and Kathleen Marshall on the way out. Catherine. But anyway, I'm the founder and CEO of IRF Secretariat, which is supporting the Global Academic Council. And just to give you a little background on what the Secretariat's doing real quick, which is, right?
Yes.
So I guess the story starts real quick with the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, which is an informal space, and we just had a roundtable meeting on Capitol Hill this morning. It was like over 2 hours long, but it's a space. It's informal, but it's a safe space where people of all faiths and beliefs gather, and in order to share stories of discrimination, persecution, and even genocide, unfortunately. But it's been going for more than 15 years now, almost 16 years. And Chris Seipel here is one of the co-founders. And I came along after they started and offered to help. And now, we're still here, and it's still going strong. And we had, I think, over 200 people there today. And what we do is, the reason we gather and share those stories is to then pull together and get everybody, to get all faiths and beliefs pulling together and engaging governments to try to persuade governments, ideally in a cooperative and constructive fashion, trying to engage governments and get them to improve on religious freedom, and offering to work with them to improve on religious freedom. So the Roundtable's been doing that, like I said, for almost 16 years. But we've seen over the last 15 plus years, and even the last 26 years, if you go all the way back to the International Religious Freedom Act that passed, that created an IRF office and an ambassador at large and a U.S. commission, that the levels of persecution are highest ever, still. They reached peak in 2022. They've leveled off at that peak. So we're trying to figure out, we need to reimagine our approach to religious freedom. And really, the movement has been dominated by the advocacy approach so far, just advocacy, which is more of a, and really the act set up really a system of negative reporting. You have these annual reports that report on violations, and it's negative reporting. And some people say it's like naming and blaming and shaming governments that are too restrictive on religion. And those governments don't like that, and they should be called out. Violations do need to be communicated and raise awareness about violations that are occurring. But that by itself clearly has not worked. And we still need advocacy, but we need to start engaging these governments cooperatively and constructively, and coming alongside and offering to work with them, like I said, and then equipping and empowering local leaders on the ground in these countries to build religious freedom from the ground up. And ideally to do it in multi-faith fashion. So that's kind of the IRF Roundtable established this model, and IRF Secretariat, we incorporated that in 2018, and we had some initial funding from Templeton Religion Trust over the last 5 years. But the idea is to build a global network of these religious freedom roundtables, these multi-faith roundtables, but even to go beyond that, because we've seen we need more than just, multi-faith roundtables are good if you have them in every community, in every country, eventually, someday, hopefully. But the idea was to establish a global network of these multi-faith roundtables, have them on every continent, in as many countries as possible. But even over the last few years, we started thinking this needs to become more than just multi-faith. We need a multi-sector approach, to confront the problem of these ultra-high levels of discrimination and persecution. So we established a global academic council first, and Jocelyn and May were gracious and very kind to agree to volunteer, for the most part, in setting up and co-chairing this council, and they recruited a good number of members of the council who then contributed to the special issue, that you have in front of you. But we need academics speaking into this, because there's gaps in research and scholarship. Because in dealing with governments too, and you're trying to get them to improve on religious freedom, they want to know, prove to me that religious freedom is good for national security and good for economic development. Like, why should we do religious freedom? If it's just a human rights issue, they're like, they're not that interested, unfortunately. So you have to put it in terms of their self-interest, right? They're definitely interested in security and stability. They're definitely interested in economic development. They want prosperity, no matter what kind of government it is, whether it's authoritarian or democratic. They want a strong economy. So we need research, more research, to make the connections to help these governments and policymakers see, why religious freedom is in their self-interest and why they should make a decision on their own to improve on religious freedom. And so that's what, instead of just an advocacy approach, we're trying to come at it. And having the academic council will be really, helpful in bringing research and evidence to bear, and showing these policymakers why, religious freedom is good for all these social, economic, and even political benefits, in their country. Because advocacy alone is not going to do it. Making them wrong is not going to get them to want to work with you to improve, right? So we have to come alongside and offer to help them, and with data analysis. Assessments, and root cause, finding and all this stuff in order to help inform joint planning, because that's what we want to do next. In addition to all the research that the council is going to bring to the table, and we're building a corporate council to bring, again, business interests, to try to get businesses to engage governments as economic partners. Okay, 5 minutes. But so you see, so we're going into multi-sector. Obviously, we also want international development. We want the broader human rights community involved in this cooperative, constructive engagement of governments that are too restrictive on religion. Really, and so what we're talking about doing is developing a holistic, like all of society approach, really, to this issue, and bringing this kind of data to these governments that are too restrictive. And then partnering with civil society organizations and faith leaders in these countries, and doing trainings, for them on how to do like multi-faith, inclusive, equal citizenship, platforms in their own countries, and how to engage the government cooperatively and constructively, where possible. But anyway, I hope that's painting a picture that's what Earth Secretariat was designed to do, to take the roundtable model to the next level, and then even beyond that to try to develop this holistic, all of society approach. And the last thing I'll say, and then I would be happy to take any questions that anybody has, but that's why I'm so excited about what the Academic Council coming together and this first special issue that they've contributed to, and I hope there's more to follow. But we really need the next step is a joint planning process that would start with assessments, and again, the council can bring data analysis and evidence to bear to inform a joint planning process, so that we actually find the right whys, the root causes, so that we can then determine what the right solution is in each country, in each region, specific to each region in each country. But then hopefully we then develop these shared initiatives that's attacking the root causes of these problems in each country. And we're bringing different sectors to bear in executing shared initiatives that will hopefully increase our impact and start to reduce the levels of discrimination and persecution, if that makes sense. But that's what we're all about. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you all again, and thank you for coming. Thank you. Sorry.
So, I don't know how much time I have left.
19 more minutes.
Okay, so I think it was sufficient on the Global Academic Council. Just to say that really what brings us together was to go beyond advocacy. And there is a tendency in the field to there is indeed someone is wrong, someone is right, and it doesn't go very far. So, and it's case by case. So the idea, and that's why we agreed to join the project, is to bring scholars from different countries, different disciplines, to look at the same issue, and hopefully to find transversal themes, not just, Chinese Muslims are persecuted. What can we do to open up a spectrum, a scope of analysis that is not only on one case study after the other? And that's why I think that what I was saying in the beginning, this globalization of religious freedom is a positive development. And we are surfing on this wave. So I'm going to stop here because it's enough, and open the floor to you. I don't know. I'm going to monitor the Q&A.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's going to be a recording device that comes around, so
Great.
wait for that before you ask your question.
So the floor is yours. Yes.
Hi, so I'm the Reverend Jennifer Butler. I'm the CEO of Faith and Democracy, and I wondered on the concept of civilizationalism, how does that underlie, or does it, the kind of idea of spheres of influence that have surfaced, particularly the U.S. national security strategy, but there are other ways in which that's surfacing, and are those two things kind of aligned?
I'm not actually particularly familiar with the spheres of influence in the context that you're talking about. Can you say more about it?
I think there's a new way of thinking about geopolitics that carves the world into spheres of influence, I guess I should say, spheres rather than zones. And I think it's attractive to a lot of autocrats in different parts of the world to carve the world up in that way. And then we see it reflected, of course, in the new national security strategy, our zone being North and South America, our zone, U.S. zone.
So I don't know specifically. Generally, it would seem that there's a high correlation, because part of the idea is that, the primary mechanism under civilizationism is no longer the nation state. It's a broader community that might not have legal state borders, right? And so the way that those spheres of influence might define who has power very much could be a center group within a civilizationist construct. So it would seem that there's parallels. I don't know in terms of the academic research. I don't know if anyone else does. If there's a direct.
It's different. It's still about ideology, what you are describing. It's about asserting the power of a state or conglomerate of states sharing the same interest. The civilizationism is about sharing an identity and defending an identity. It's slightly different, and it can bring together different ideological perspectives, and it can also latch on different transnational groups and messages. It's slightly different.
Thank you. I'm Chris Huth. I work with Churches for Middle East Peace, so feel free to engage with me outside later, if you will. I have a question regarding, international religious freedom, and specifically what was said when speaking to governments, that this kind of needs to be centered on how it is beneficial to them, which is something that I have witnessed in personal advocacy and many issues that I've been on the Hill with and spoken to senators and congressional members. My question to that is, where is the fine line between international religious freedom and advocating for that, and that becoming a tool for nefarious purposes, such as foreign meddling in countries, the influence and the funding of certain groups, and kind of to actually tear a country apart, rather than it is to consolidate, which I would agree with generally, stability within the country by allowing for international freedom of religion, but rather for imperial powers to then use certain religious groups to further their own benefit in that region, kind of also spheres of influence related.
Greg, you want to
Can I speak from here, or do you know?
You can speak from there.
That's a good question. It's a tough question, but we don't. We try to stay above the politics, and we've definitely gone into areas that see international religious freedom as a Western construct and neo-imperialism or neo-colonialism. And so and some of them don't even, if you do an event on religious freedom, the governments won't participate. So we've gone in, and first of all, here's the thing too, we always go in with a local partner. We don't go in all by ourselves. We always go in with the support of the government too. And if we don't have a local partner, and if the government's not okay with us coming in, we don't go. We're not there. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing is working with local partners and the government. We're there really to help. Again, we're offering to come alongside them and help them. And we don't dictate what they need, what they should do, and how they should do it. We just come in and share what we're doing and what we have found to be helpful at like building social cohesion, across deep differences. Like our roundtable brings together, again, it's inclusive of all faiths. It's radically inclusive, traditional and non-traditional. And we have found that getting them engaging each other and working together in multi-faith fashion actually builds mutual respect, trust, reliance, even love across deep differences. That's why we started thinking of how we should share this model with people around the world and see if they would want to set up their own versions of it. So that's all we do. We go in and share what we have found to be helpful here, and then if they want to then take it and set up a multi-faith, it could be a forum or an alliance, or they can name it whatever they want. But if they want to do it, they can learn from our model, but then they can customize it for their own local context, and ideally work with their government. And we're out of the picture at that point. We just go in and share what we have found to be helpful. And if they then take it and then they build it and they own it themselves. And we can be there to be supportive if they want us to continue to be supportive in an advisory role or whatever, but really it's up to them. And it's all their own decision and their own self-determinism. It's not us forcing anything on them. And we have found that to be, it's workable. And even authoritarian governments in former Soviet Union, and I'm not saying that they change overnight, but they're on the road, gradual progress, incremental change. and it's long-term work. This does not happen overnight. We've been engaging with Kazakhstan and Wade and Chris. I've been there with them going back 12 years, more than 12 years now. And they're still not great on religious freedom, but they're getting better gradually. And I hope that answers it.
And maybe I'll just jump in, because I was going to say this in the introduction of the Global Academic Council. Part of, I think, the way we serve is that our desire is to be an intersection point between academics and practitioners. And so being multi-sector, where the Secretariat is working with governments, and I heard you say, doing things to their benefit, not that that means unilateral ideological support, but doing things to their benefit in terms of a pragmatic way of being able to make progress and dialogue and conversation. But the Academic Council, I think there's the political component. We also work with religious leaders, but then grassroots or civil society would be another segment. And where academics might not have the opportunity to speak into these governments, part of what the Global Academic Council allows is translating the academic work to practical manifestations that can then serve constructive work on the governmental level.
Yes, I see your hand.
It seems like that overlaps a lot with, it's Mitch, is that right? What you were saying about raising the literacy level of folks around their idea of how religious freedom impacts different political decisions and foreign policy and our approach to this. As you've thought about raising literacy levels in this, what are some of the ideas of, because to prioritize that, there are a lot of people that are saying, I've got so many more things to focus on. How do we raise this as a piece of concern for people that don't prioritize this in their ideas of policy making and even business, ventures?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think through building relationships with people who are of those backgrounds and hearing from them about what's important to them and the practices that they engage in, and just building that rapport is a good place to start.
If I may add something, I would be very cautious on thinking that increasing the literacy diminishes repression. It doesn't. It's a question of interest. People can be very educated and still consider that it is in their interest. That's why here the collective is important. You can educate one person at a time, but there are structural conditions about political issues, socioeconomic challenges, and that will not change the repression. And I know how hard it is to get out of the individual interest to look at these structural issues. And that's why at some point religious freedom cannot be advocacy anymore. It has to be a data-driven, comparative, because if you just focus on one thing, indeed the countries, the leaders, the group are going to feel like, what is with us? It is comparative. The moment you open the comparison and you try to work on structure, it's very different than saying, we're going to educate you on religion.
Right.
I honestly have an issue with that, and it shows it doesn't work. I mean, this I took from my Islamic background. The most strongest Islamophobe are very well informed of what is Islam. They just don't want. They don't care, and they don't want. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say one thing about the comparative too. We started just by sharing our U.S. experience, but over time, as other leaders did they have set up their own roundtables in their own countries, in different parts of the world. So as time went by and we had more of these folks setting up roundtables, it became a comparative. Whenever we would then go in and educate them, we would educate them about the American experience, but then we would have other partners from Latin America or Africa or Central Asia also then sharing their experiences in taking the model and customizing it, the way they were comfortable doing it, right? So it is it's comparative. And so people in Southeast Asia, or again across the former Soviet Union, will be much more attuned to seeing how somebody in Kazakhstan took this and implemented it, than just us Americans, right?
Yeah.
It's a great question, because I'm going to jump in too and just add briefly another recent issue of the journal. It's my second favorite journal issue of all time. It looks at what we call covenantal pluralism. It's a long story. I won't go into all the details of it, but prospects for covenantal pluralism in different countries around the world. And one of the key dimensions of this concept of covenantal pluralism is what we call cross-cultural religious literacy. And yeah, it's a concept that sort of wrestles with what you're saying. Do we mean literacy as in having everybody walking around with a master's degree in comparative religion? That's obviously we can't educate in that kind of way to that level. But it's more about a disposition, an attitude towards the possibility of expanding one's religious literacy. And we're sitting here at Georgetown, and a concept coming out of recent Catholic social thought, the building cultures of encounter, I think is very similar, a very similar ethos to what we mean by cross-cultural religious literacy. So a disposition of openness towards engagement of the religious other to the possibility of knowing at least a lived relational level the religious other.
We have 5 minutes to get more feedback, comments from you.
Did you have one?
I don't know if it's good or bad. Maybe we have responded to all questions.
Maybe a closing comment from each of you.
Yes, that's a very good point. So, great.
I mean, I just got here, so I'll go last. Yeah, well, I'll listen to you all, and then I'll give you the close. Yeah, right.
So, Dennis, go please.
Oh, well, as many have said, this is the first product, so to speak, of the Global Academic Council, and it was a real honor to be able to partner with the council. I'm a member of the council, but also to be able to use the pages of the journal in this way. And so we've covered a lot of ground, but not everything. There's a lot of work to be done, both in terms of future research projects, and then also new ways of connecting research to practitioners, to policymakers, to strategic decision making. So I would just invite all of you here to be thinking about projects and bring them to us at the council, to the journal for agenda setting going forward.
Yeah.
So now I have a question.
Here we go.
Well, I thought of this, Dennis, when you were giving the introduction.
Hold on, you need the mic.
You don't need to record this. I wonder what you left out of this, but we can talk later.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
May.
Yes. I mean, some of the question we sought to answer is what needs to be done and what's missing. So some of what that journal answers is the answer to the question you just posed in that regard, because we meant for this to be a broad landscaping. I think we're really grateful to Georgetown and to all of you for coming. One of our goals also, the Global Academic Council is very international. We have academics, in Africa. Forgive me, I don't know what country.
Africa, Latin America.
In Latin America.
Eastern Europe.
And the Middle East.
Middle East.
The UAE, Israel, but also Jordan. And so one of the goals is that it really not be US-centric and that it not be Western-centric. And so some of the questions we're asking or some of the future projects really also depend on, even the countries we're engaging in with these roundtables. Right. We've been in Berlin and we've been in Prague. And one of our goals is to do smaller contexts. This is the launch of this journal officially, but we're looking for academic institutions where we could have a day-long conversation on this, with the council, with the local academics at those institutions. And so in addition to the strategic work we're doing with the Business Council, the next steps from the questions raised in the journal, one of the other things is also just being present in that international academic conversation. And I know you said this, but I really want to emphasize our Global Academic Council are not all academics of religion. And I think that's what's really, really profound about this group, is they are academics who care about international religious freedom or intersect with it, but some are academics of human rights, or some are academics of what are all the fields? Gender studies,
Sociology,
security.
That's the intersectionality we were discussing.
Trying to really
Yeah, which I think is one of the unique strengths, because it allows us, even our methodology within different academic sectors is totally different. You know, our historical methodology is I'm an academic historian, let alone religion, is completely different than sociology, et cetera.
Just to finish, it is a moment where the data cannot be driven by one institution or one discipline, and we are learning a lot of. It's challenging, and it's also very humbling, because you look at the same phenomenon or issue, but you have different lenses on the same issue.
That's right.
And how do you move from that, from a concerted or rational or coherent analysis that can serve policy making? We are in the process of that. But that is the moment indeed you cannot talk. And I know research is individual, academic are very lonely people, but this is the moment you have to work together. There is no way you can know everything if you really want to understand the complexity of things. And that's why we are very grateful that Greg gave us this opportunity to work as a group. Yeah. It's time to wrap up, I'm told by
We did it.
I would just say that we talk about it as freedom of religion, but it's a fundamental right in that it touches a lot of other rights, right? So everybody, whether you think it does or not, it does impact you. And so I would just, in a word of encouragement, that everyone has a role to play in that. Whether you're formally or informally in the space or not, doesn't matter. There's a role to play for you out there. So,
Greg.
I'll just see. This is good that I went last, because I'll just build on all of that. Just something new that comes out of this week, because you had the IRF summit 2 days ago, and then we had our roundtable today. But we're going to be IRF Secretariat's going to be partnering with Good Faith Partnership in London, and we're going to develop a civil society platform or a collaborative. But like you just said, this is something that affects all parts of life, which is why we need a holistic approach. And like you said, everybody's got a role to play. And even when you're pulling people together for these academic projects, I mean, this civil society collaborative is going to be, it's designed to be multi-sector and to try to pull everybody together and get everybody working together on this attacking this problem and coming up with constructive solutions. You know, and having all the different sectors like speaking into it and collaborate, like cross-pollinating across sectors, and this council can help with that. But yeah, we plan to launch this in May. We plan to have like a builders forum in Washington in May. If you're all interested, we'll invite everybody. You know, so we have basically 3 months to prepare for like a hard launch of this new civil society collaborative that will work alongside governments. That will work alongside the Article 18 Alliance of 43 governments, but that's advocacy oriented. So we'll also work to to engage other governments as well that aren't in the alliance. But anyway, it's that's the new thing. And if you're interested in working with us and working with the council in any way, just let us know, and we're open. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you for your attention and interest, and to be continued, right?
Yes.
That's just the starting point of something. Thank you very much.
Thank you.